Good afternoon, and welcome to the Port of San Diego Harbor Police meeting on the use of military equipment. My name is Magda Fernandez, and I am the Chief of the San Diego Harbor Police. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to listen to our meeting and tune in. Harbor Police staff will be briefing you on the requirements of Assembly Bill 481 Military Equipment Use Policy. You will hear about accountability, funding, procurement, and the approval requirements for this type of equipment that HPD maintains. If you have any questions related to any of the equipment on our list, please let one of our staff know. QR codes have been provided so you can view the list of equipment HPD has. I value your feedback and your input as it relates to the use of military equipment. With that said, this evening we will be focusing solely on military equipment as it's required, and we will not be discussing any other topics. I thank you for your time, patience, and your support. I will turn this presentation over to Administrative Captain Jonathan George.
Thank you, Chief. For the purposes of what you're seeing on the screen, there is 2 QR codes on the title page there. For reference, at any point, if you use your cell phone in photo mode, you should be able to, through that QR code on the left, see Harbor Police's military equipment list in its 48 to 50 page document. And on the right is the policy related to that use and documentation of military equipment. We'll get into why we are listing the policy and the equipment list a little bit later as part of the Assembly Bill, but that is what you're seeing on the screen. And I wanted to give you enough time to bring those up on your phone if interested. Next slide. So there's a lot of things we're going to discuss about military equipment, but the most important part of this outline, in my opinion, and I think in the command staff's opinion, is to explain why the Harbor Police needs this equipment to function and to protect the public in as safe manner as possible. Clearly, there is a lot of concern around the procurement and possession of military equipment by local law enforcement. And the goal today is to talk about one, to remove the veil so everyone can understand what we have, but 2, understand the reasons why we are procuring this. It's not an attempt to, gain a bunch of this equipment and stick it in the closet somewhere just to say we have it. Each one of these pieces of equipment have a specific function and are necessary to do the things you're seeing on this screen. Clearly, they're meant to protect life and safeguard the community. In many cases, as we get into, there are de-escalation tools. Just by their very presence at a scene, they bring a safe resolution of many critical incidents. And it allows our officers to be properly equipped so they can safely perform their jobs. In some cases, remotely and away from danger, or at least as far away as possible as that danger presents itself at a scene. Next slide. So what is military equipment? So basically, we had to understand from the state standpoint what the definition or their intent was when they were defining military equipment. It's essentially common use police equipment that was redefined by California State Legislature under Assembly Bill 41. It changed Government Code 770 through 775, modified it to include a list of what that equipment and what category it falls under, how that equipment is again procured and vetted through a governing board. But essentially, that's what it is. It's commonly used police equipment. It is not something that I think a lot of people assume, which is, high-powered weaponry only, tanks, things that, you might see on the news as kind of a thing that would catch people's eyes in terms of, really hotly contested equipment. Some of the stuff we're going to list, you would actually probably be surprised to find out has been defined as military equipment. The stuff that police agencies have been using in patrol for many years. This includes command vehicles, drones, less lethal tools such as beanbag shotguns, and other equipment we already have. None of this equipment that we use, the HPD uses, was obtained actually from the military. And I'll talk about this in a second, but we do not participate in the federal LESO 1033 surplus military equipment program. Next slide. Okay, so the background to Assembly Bill 41, it was introduced in the California Senate early in 2021, roughly February of 2021. It was ultimately passed on the floor in September of 2021. The author of that bill was at the time Senator David Chu. He's now the San Francisco Attorney General. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, it basically modified already existing law, which was that government code 770 through 775. The main purpose of this, and it's going to be clear as we talk about this stuff, and the whole reason we're even here, was that it was designed to create more transparency in law enforcement. There are a lot of laws right now that essentially in California are designed to do that, and this one is one of those laws. The three things that really I took away when we kind of analyzed this bill and how it was going to affect our way of doing business at the port was the Senate and the House legislature wanted to obviously define what military equipment is in the state of California's eyes. They want to require transparency and understanding from the law enforcement agency's governing body, and we'll cover who that is in a minute for the port, on what military equipment is and what that department either has or wants to obtain in the future, and allow for transparency for the public to understand what quote unquote high liability equipment their police departments possess or are trying to procure. Remember, high liability is essentially a term that I'm putting in there. It's not something the state is introduced, but when we get into the list of equipment, you'll understand what I mean by that. Most of the equipment that we're going to cover, or a lot of the equipment, I should say, is possessed and used by our special weapons and tactic team, our SWAT team. And for the port, that's Maritime Tactical Team or MARTAC team. So you may hear that term MARTAC or Maritime Tactical. It's interchanged with the common term SWAT. Next slide. So just looking at the bill again, and this is something that you can find very easily if you Google Assembly Bill 41. You can actually get the full legal breakdown of each part of that code, 770 through 775. But we're going to cover the main portions here as it pertains to the required report out of military equipment use. So in 771A1, it basically now mandates that any law enforcement agency must obtain approval from the governing body by an ordinance adopting a military use policy at a regular meeting of the governing body. I'll get into the rest of that in a second, but that part is essentially the Board of Port Commissioners is our governing body. In some cities, that's the city council, a county council. The Board of Port Commissioners are the governing body for the Harbor Police in the Port of San Diego. Prior to engaging any of the following, we must go to that board and ask basically for permission to either procure, which is A, requesting military equipment made available to Section 2576A of Title 10 of the U.S. Code. That is the, like I referenced before, the LESO 1033 program, the Law Enforcement Support Office. That's what LESO stands for, the subdivision of DoD. That is a way for local police departments to procure military type equipment from federal military entities for free. That can be anything from weapons or non-weapons, but the military is essentially ready to annex or offload. They will supply that through a liaison with the DoD to a local law enforcement agency to use until that service life is complete. We used to participate in that program. It's long since ended for us. We've turned all that equipment back in. We do not participate anymore. But if we had, we would still have to go to the governing body and request that permission to obtain that gear through that program. B, seeking funds for military equipment, including but not limited to applying for a grant, soliciting or accepting private, local, state, or federal funds, which in-kind donations or other donations or transfers. So pretty much any way you can obtain funding for this military equipment, you need the governing board or governing body to rule on first. And then C, even if you are temporarily going to borrow the gear or lease the gear or equipment, you still need that approval. So there's no loophole really that exists for us as a department or any law enforcement agency, local law enforcement agency in California to obtain this equipment without first asking for permission. Like I mentioned, the governing body is the Board of Port Commissioners, and that military equipment use policy that's highlighted in red, the requirement, that is, like I said, the first slide where you see that QR code. That is policy, HPD policy 712. That is publicly accessible, and you can look it up at any time, either through that QR code or through our website. Next slide. So obviously, we're going to spend a little time on this slide. It's pretty packed full of information here. Again, if you were to look up Government Code 7070 subsection C, you would see a similar list to this. Essentially, it is the goal of the legislature was to try to lay out every type of equipment they've defined as military equipment. Some of these things, again, have been possessed by law enforcement, local law enforcement agencies for years. They've just now been categorized as military equipment. And some are probably a little bit newer technology or things that are not as common. So number one, unmanned, remotely piloted, powered aerial or ground vehicles. So that's a pretty big category. And the Harbor Police does have a couple things that would fit in that category. One is that we do have aerial drones, along with a drone team and policy governing them internally through the Harbor Police. We have several different models of drones. I'm not going to go through every specific model it is in the equipment list. If you really want to see the exact make, model, down to the serial number type thing, you can look it up. But some of the drones are meant for internal flying, external, and some are meant for external flying. Some have thermal capabilities. These types of devices are used quite commonly in law enforcement. We use it all the time in law enforcement, both from a situational awareness standpoint, large crowd monitoring for big events, all the way down to special weapons and tactics events where we're potentially going to serve a warrant or work towards a house, like solving an issue with an armed individual. We might use this drone for some advanced eyes on, so to speak, of a target, so the officers maybe can avoid stepping into a potentially dangerous situation. So it is a de-escalation tool, like we talked about before, for some reasons why we need this. This can be used as a de-escalation tool. It can also be used for search and rescue. The thermal capabilities we have in that drone at night over the water. You have somebody who's gone overboard in a boat. Is not uncommon for helicopters or other airborne aircraft to use thermal technology to locate a heat signature, kind of saving a search and rescue from searching a large area down to a very small area for somebody. And our drones can do that as well. At least some of our drones can. In addition to that, we have some tracked robots or ground vehicles. One possessed by the SWAT team, again, essentially similar to a drone in the air. This device can be used to approach a target or approach in a situation that might be deemed dangerous or analyzed as dangerous by a SWAT commander or team, and potentially either communicate with somebody around a corner or behind a door or in a backyard, all kinds of different environments without an officer or tactical individual moving up to potentially put themselves in harm's way. In addition to that, we have essentially a range robot. It's essentially an armored robot that we use sometimes. It's been a while since we've actually used this, but we're still in possession of it, so we're going to talk about it. But it can be used on the range as a moving target in a training environment only. We wouldn't use that in a patrol setting or in a call response setting. The second thing on that list is armored personnel carriers. That's pretty clear what, generally what that means. For us and for a lot of law enforcement agencies, that means an armored vehicle. And most departments, at least regionally around our area here in San Diego, use the same model we use, which is the Bearcat G2. It is a individual armored vehicle built on a Ford F-550 chassis, designed by a specific company out east, purely for the protection of personnel in a armed situation where they might anticipate getting gunfire shot at them or a gunfire in a call. Ours specifically is a CBRN model, which is detection of chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, or explosive materials. So there's some sensors in that vehicle that can aid officers at a call or personnel at a call that they suspect any type of, potential incendiary bomb or something that might have one of those types of metrics in it, and they can potentially detect that from longer range without having to get up on top of a bag or a device that has something like that in it. It's, again, in our opinion at least, and in a lot of law enforcement's opinion, a de-escalation tool in a lot of ways, because Using that device while having personnel inside of it, we can insert people into a scene, SWAT officers or even patrol officers in a rescue call, and rescue people out of an active shooter scene or put people in an armed environment where they don't have to necessarily return fire while they're getting shot at. The vehicle is rated to take on a pretty high caliber amount of ammunition, multiple rounds striking same locations. It's been tested. It's a very strong and trustworthy device in those situations. So that is essentially a piece of SWAT equipment, but again, patrol may use that in certain situations. And that is the only piece of armored personnel carrier that we have that will qualify under number 2. As you can see on the slide, I've highlighted in red several of these categories don't apply to us. And so my plan is to kind of skip through those and not even mention them, mainly because, one, we don't have those here and we have no plans to procure them anytime soon. And of course, if that changed, not only would we have to go to the governing board to ask for that permission, we would have to report out to you in every annual meeting we have with the public. So there'd be no way for us to hide that in the future if that did change. We'll go right to number 5, command and control vehicles. Again, these are vehicles used at a maybe critical incident or serious situation involving staff dealing with like a large scale event. Could be a special event like we have of our Big Bay Boom every year. We use our command vehicle there. It's got different pieces of equipment in it that allow us to monitor the event safely from a command post. We also have a vehicle that the SWAT team uses that could be considered a command and control vehicle. While the definition may not mean it, we're just going to include it from a transparency standpoint. And that's our white panel van or panel truck that the SWAT team uses to carry equipment and gear to certain scenes as a support vehicle. So those 2 vehicles would qualify under number 5. Again, skipping ahead to number 9. And number 9 is ammunition of 50 caliber or greater, not including standard shotgun ammunition. I'm very glad they didn't include that because pretty much every law enforcement agency in America at this point probably carries or has carried recently a standard issue shotgun. So they left that out. However, even leaving that out for us, we do have several things that qualify. And so for us, that would be .223 caliber ammunition, rifle ammunition. Could also be considered 5.56 millimeter, both practice and duty. We also carry .308 and .338 ammunition, and those 2 last categories, .308 and .338, are carried by our snipers on our SWAT team. The .223 ammunition, both practice and duty, is carried by our SWAT team and our patrol officers who are issued patrol rifles, which we'll get into in a second here. Number 10, specialized firearms and ammunition of less than 50 caliber, including assault weapons as defined by 305.10 and 305.15 of the Penal Code. Those would be the rifles I just mentioned. The AR-15 platform, which is a very common, it's been around for many, many years, both in the military, obviously, and now in law enforcement for decades. We carry several models of that. Colt M4, Daniel Defense DD-M4 model, which is an 11.5-inch barrel upper portion of the gun, meaning like shorter barrel. 308 and a 338 sniper rifle. We have multiple models for that as well. And again, those are carried by our SWAT team. And last but not least, this would be a trivia question at some point probably, but we actually still have in our possession a Colt Carbine SP1. It was an asset seizure weapon, but based on the model and caliber of it, it would qualify under this category, so we need to report it. And meaning we seized it during a call for service. It was turned over to us by the DOJ through a process, likely at the time for training and familiarization for our officers, and we still have it to this day. It was years ago that we got it. We don't deploy it in the field, and we wouldn't use it at calls. Going back to the platforms I mentioned before, the AR-15, 308, 338 sniper rifles. The Colt M4, the models that we have for that are both select and single fire weapons. We issue those to our patrol officers. They have to go through, again, specific training to carry those, advanced training, but pretty much every officer that's in our field service is carrying one of those weapons. In addition, our SWAT folks will be carrying the Daniel Defense DDM4, that 11.5-inch barrel. That's mainly due to the fact that they're clearing buildings and going through doorways, and a shorter barrel assists them in doing that. All these weapons, including the sniper rifles, have a specific mission. These aren't weapons that you're going to see most of the time deployed out in the public, unless it's an extreme situation. They're generally kept in vehicles or in bags, locked up and secured in safes. They're in places where, not generally deployed around somebody's shoulder, arm, or neck. Again, unless there's a call and a need for it. But it does unfortunately give us the ability in a situation where we're facing firepower of that magnitude from suspects or criminals that are, attacking other citizens or us, to defend ourselves in an equal fashion. Number 11, again, I'm not going to cover. We don't at this point have anything that would qualify. Number 12. So again, something that's related to our SWAT team. We do carry in the vernacular is flashbang. That's why it's in quotes, but it's essentially a light and sound diversionary device, an LSDD. They are, for lack of a better term, quantified as grenades, but obviously not designed to explode or kill anybody. They are designed to, obviously, as they're listed, create light and sound to divert someone's attention while we're trying to make entry into an area that we are concerned someone might be monitoring for our approach. So like a lot of the SWAT teams do, they will use these devices to distract someone to look the other direction while a team moves in from another location. That can also be used as a warning signal for different things during a SWAT call. But these are used by our SWAT team exclusively. They're not issued to patrol, and they're used in very specific situations, mainly in many cases to hopefully de-escalate from having to immediately get into a gun battle with somebody when making entry into an area or trying to contact somebody. It gives us a few seconds of distraction time to potentially get close to somebody before we have to engage in a gun battle. In addition to that, in that category, number 12, which would fall under tear gas tools and explosive breaching tools, we do have a gas ram and a burn safe. Those devices are, again, deployed by a SWAT team with special training. They are, for lack of a better term, vessels to carry gas canisters that are deployed, so gas is coming out of them. They're put in these devices to direct that gas to a certain specific location. So in the event of a gas ram, which can be through an attachment put on our Bearcat or by hand carried into a location, there is a tube with a canister that goes into it with an end piercing point that the gas will come out of once you pierce a building or location, with the goal that if we wanted to insert gas into a location without having to go into the building or go in through a window, we could use that tool to do that, either remotely, like I said, with the Bearcat, or even by hand if we can do it in a safe way with personnel. The burn safe, similar to that, is a canister, large canister that you could put gas into and then toss through a window. Essentially allows pyrotechnic gas to burn inside this container without setting anything in the room or in the house or in the structure on fire, but while deploying that gas, that chemical gas. So those are, again, just vessels for these types of gas deployment tools to be used with. In addition to that, we have chemical gas, which is CS and OC. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, and I don't have it written down, the scientific name for those two types of gas. They are very long names, but they are used quite frequently in law enforcement, mainly by SWAT teams, but also in some circumstances by patrol. And they vary in medium, meaning we have them in canisters like pyrotechnic, like I mentioned, that will burn. We have them in tri-chamber devices where you can throw and they'll break into 3 pieces and burn separately in 3 pieces. We have them in ferret rounds where we can launch them from 40mm launchers into certain locations to deploy remotely. So we have a lot of ways to deploy that type of tool, and that gas is essentially used to drive someone from one location to another, for lack of a better way of describing it. It's a very simple way of thinking of it. Trying to move someone from the building outside Can be used in some circumstances in riot or crowd control, which is also tightly controlled by law now. But you can essentially use that gas to move someone out of an area you want to move them out of. And there's, again, specialized training by our SWAT folks, SWAT team members to do that. In addition to that, we have, as the section asks, if you have this, you need to list it, pepper balls. Pepper balls is kind of like a brand term, but it describes what looks like a lot like a paintball, but filled with OC pepper particles, pava or pepper particles. They are launched by for lack of a better way of describing it, a paintball launcher, a Tippmann paintball launcher. And so it's very similar to what you've probably seen in many cases on TV or in different movies. These just, instead of paintballs coming out, these are filled with OC, and they have them for a lot of different types of them, but the ones we use are either filled with OC or CS. Again, these can be used remotely to try to either control an individual that's violent and resistant and refusing to leave an area. They can be used to drive someone from an area if you don't want them near something, i.e. subject who's near a knife, you don't want them to approach it, you can use it to deny that area from them, which again, doesn't sound like a de-escalation tool, but it can be used exactly for that. It's considered a less lethal tool. Obviously, it's designed to be non-lethal, and the ones that we carry are used in that fashion. We have several types of ammunition for those devices, mainly the one that I mentioned, the OC-based PAVA powder that's inside those, but we also have inert ammunition to train with, and in the event that we needed to use the tool to break glass, i.e., back of a car window to insert gas into if someone was refusing to come out of a car, that type of scenario, or a house, we have some that are designed to break glass. Number 13, long-range acoustic device, an LRAD. We do have two of those. Both the LRAD, or long-range acoustic device, has a couple different functions for the police department. It can be used both in a SWAT environment, but also in patrol. It's a loud electronic acoustic device where you can either project your voice or any type of sound through, or use pre-programmed buttons or programs in the LRAD system to create a loud, pretty obnoxious noise to drive people from an area. 99% of the time, those devices are used just for the first reason I mentioned, is to make public service announcements, to tell people to leave an area, maybe in the event that you're concerned a protest is turning violent or into a riot. To communicate with people from a long distance, and to communicate with a lot of people in a very short period of time. And like I mentioned, it does have the ability in certain situations, and again, you need some specialized training to use it for this, but to use a loud, obnoxious noise to try to drive people away as a less lethal tool. And again, there are times when we would use something like that are very few and far between, but it is a capability that that device has. Number 14, we're almost at the end of this slide, so bear with me. We do have 40 millimeter launchers, which I mentioned before, uses, one of the reasons we use that are to launch chemical ferret rounds by our SWAT team. But we have a couple of these devices. They are called 40 millimeter launchers or extended range impact weapons, because you can also use them to fire sponge rounds, which we also possess for either as a less lethal tool, almost like a beanbag round, to impact people in certain parts of their body to get them to comply. So we have a couple of those devices, and our SWAT team are the ones that are trained on those and would use those in the field. We do not deploy those by patrol officers. We do have, in addition to that, beanbag shotguns. Again, the vernacular beanbag. It is a super sock ammunition that's essentially a composite material wrapped around a very soft insert that essentially is meant to be an impact round on somebody's body. Our patrol officers will deploy those quite regularly as a less lethal de-escalation tool to avoid having to use lethal force. They are used probably pretty commonly in law enforcement now around the country as a less lethal tool. We do make sure we carry those, that type of ammunition, that type of tool in a completely separate platform than our regular patrol shotguns, to include the shotgun itself being completely marked differently. It's a nickel covered marine grade finish on the shotgun. So we don't, to avoid weapon confusion, but those are used by our patrol officers and our SWAT officers. And then lastly, in that category, we have what is considered SIM weapons and SIM ammunition. SIM meaning specialty impact munitions. Those are training devices. We can basically train as close to a realistic firefight situation as you can imagine. These are kind of like I mentioned, pepper ball in terms of paintball. It's a similar design or similar function in that the front of these rounds have paint markers on them. And they are loaded with, they're loaded by special magazines and have special uppers that we can place on top of a weapon so that it will only fire simunition, ammunition, and not real ammunition. So there's no chance of cross-contamination. We have them both for our 9mm handguns and our 223 rifles. And then lastly, I'm just going to mention, as because it requires any other equipment as determined by a governing body or a state agency to require additional oversight. We do carry, our SWAT team carries night vision devices, night vision goggle devices or NVGs, and infrared sighting systems, which is essentially a both visual and non-visual laser that our SWAT team uses to target at night. Again, this requires specialized training. There is some DOJ oversight, and so that's why I'm mentioning it. It's similar to what most people would imagine when you put a night vision goggle on. You can see in low or no light. And then the laser that is not visual, not seen by the naked eye, that night vision goggle can actually pick it up on a target. So you can use it covertly in a very tactical situation that our SWAT team would, deploy those in. All right, next slide. Okay, so part of the law, going back to it, now that we've gone through the list of stuff that we have, I want to talk about the requirement for us basically to continue seeking out approval from a governing board. So no later than May 1st of 2022, which we've already obviously passed that point, so we've done this a couple times. Any agency seeking to continue the use of this military equipment that was acquired prior to January 1st of that year have to go through that governing board approval process in accordance with Government Code 770 through 775. So we've had to do that twice now already. That includes, again, creating that equipment list, creating that policy, presenting it to the board, and having the board of port commissioners approve our continued use of it. We make those documents obviously available on our public-facing website as well per this law. And I've got a picture here, and it's not an actual link, but if you go to our transparency and accountability section of the Harbor Police's public-facing site, you will find this exact button, I should say, or buttons, right, listed under Assembly Bill AB 481, and you can click on any of these things to both see the full law, if you want to read the full bill, and or access the two documents from that I mentioned from that initial QR code on the first page. We were required 30 days prior to any of the public hearing to post that, so we obviously did that a while ago, but it's required to do it and update it annually. And then, kind of as I referenced, every year, at least annually, at the bottom there, you can see the governing board has to be re-presented the current equipment list, or the proposed equipment list, I should say, going into the next year, and vote again on whether they're going to grant the department the continued allowance to possess or procure any of that equipment. That includes a reporting out of any usage the year before. Last slide, or almost last slide. So didn't break it down by each exact code, but it's basically 772 through A1 through A6. The equipment use procedure has to allow for that, like I mentioned, annual use reporting, which ours does. A complaint and audit process for misuse, which means anytime someone files a complaint alleging that we either misused the equipment that we're entrusted to use or didn't feel like we used it properly in some manner. They have to be able to complain, and we have to have an auditing process to audit those complaints. I'm proud to say so far, knock on wood, since we've been reporting, we haven't had one single complaint of any misuse of our equipment. Obviously our goal is to continue that going forward. We also have to list the total cost of the program for agency, quantity possessed of each item, and quantity sought for any new and replacement items. So going back to that mention of that equipment list, if you were to go to the back side of that, you would see some annexes. You would see Annex A and B, and there's all kinds of information on those annexes about how much each piece of equipment costs, how much it costs in totality, where we purchased it from, who we purchased it from, if it was grant purchased, if it was budget purchased, all this kind of information from a transparency standpoint. So if you have any questions about any of the gear I mentioned earlier, the equipment that we possessed and how we got it and what we paid for it and all that information, it's all listed on that equipment list at the very back end of that, both, like I said, in Annex A and Annex B. And that concludes the presentation. I don't believe we have any questions from the public today. So I'm going to close the presentation. And if you do have any questions in the future, you can please direct them to the Harbor Police. We'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.